Okay, so this is inspired partly by a particular question. Well, it's inspired by agreeing to get involved in a court case, and one of the challenges is, what is the question, before we can even worry about how do we answer the question. So this is not meant to be a set of answers, this is meant to be a set of questions that you can give me comments on. Depending on how the timing goes, it might be helpful to give me those comments in writing afterwards, rather than necessarily all the way as I go through. So the basic claim is about joint replacements being defective. So this is consumer protection legislation in the UK, not negligence. So you're not trying to find fault with an individual, you're just saying that a product is not what you would expect. You don't expect your microwave to burst into flames. You don't expect your kettle to, if it says it's going to turn off when it's boiling, you don't expect it not to, and to end up steaming away for long enough and then bursting into flames. So that's the idea. But you're then going to show it's defective, and so if somebody says this joint replacement is defective, we've got to decide what it means. And
so sorry, are you talking about a single instance, or are you talking about the whole?
We're talking about
line?
a type, shall we say? We're talking about this type, this kettle. So
Right.
that's what I'm saying.
Okay.
That's why it's not an individual thing.
Right. So this entire model range.
It's
is
saying
defective.
your Samsung 7 is defective. Okay, that's probably a good illustration to use, right? It's defective, and it's not arguing about whether, well, this one didn't burst into flames, but that one did. Okay. The idea is you're saying this joint replacement is defective. It's not such as a reasonable consumer could legitimately expect. Not what they actually expect, but what they could legitimately expect. And by joint, of course, we could be talking about a hip, knee, shoulder, elbow, wrist, ankle. But when you say the joint, when you say the joint replacement is defective, what do you mean? Does it mean it hasn't achieved the result I expected, and that result might be pain relief, which is the early reason for hip replacement? It might be allowing me to walk a certain distance. So for example, on Wednesday I saw Linda White, a former colleague, who's had multiple hip replacements and walks with crutches, but as far as she's concerned, it's very effective. She can walk a couple of kilometres, and that's fine. Of course, other people might say, well, I want a hip replacement so that I can run marathons or play squash or something else. So that's one possible way of thinking about it being defective. You might say, well, the hip joint wears, it releases particles, and that causes problems. You might say it dislocates easily, which causes problems. You might say it breaks, which causes problems. You might also say, hi Dave, it's difficult to resurface or replace. So Linda White, whom I mentioned, one hip has been in since 1994, the other one has had to be replaced 5 times. Okay, that's actually because of congenital malformation, but you can see that might, for some people, the ability to replace might be important. And then there's a question of, well, it's had to be replaced sooner than I expected. So how are we going to find the right data, relevant data? How are we going to assess the evidence? And then we might have the fun of assigning responsibility, because of course, if you go and buy a Samsung phone, you've chosen to buy the phone. And that's sort of all that it takes. And then obviously if you decide to use it by hitting somebody over the head with it, that's your choice, not the manufacturer's or anybody else's. But a joint is not something you could put in for yourself. And therefore you actually got other people like surgeons, the rest of the operating theatre team, the pre and post care, and so on. So that's, I don't think, going to be a particularly easy question. Okay, so it seems that the claim in this case is this joint replacement is defective means just one thing. Now, if I said to you, I want you to say what you mean by this joint replacement is defective, this particular what would you mean? How would you measure it? Well, in this particular case, the focus appears to be it has had to be replaced sooner than I expected. And I might use the abbreviations THA, THR. So I'm now just going to focus on this one question, although there are lots of other questions we could have asked. Interestingly enough, there's some debate about the legitimacy of asking just one question. So a bit like the talk which I enjoyed and Gillian didn't, about if you say you must treat people equally, have you thought about which definition of equal you're using? And have you considered the possibility that there may be conflicts? So the couple of expert witness cases I've been involved with, drugs and side effects, interestingly enough, one drug, they both had serious side effects, but one drug is still on the market because it works, as well as having side effects. The other is not on the market, despite the fact that it works very well. So the question, how are we going to find the relevant data and assess the evidence, and then think about the responsibility for now this question of replacement sooner than I expected? Is it going to be the surgeon, the operating team, the nursing team, the person's lifestyle? If you've been given, if you've had a chunk of metal put into your arm and then you're told this will not heal if you immediately go and swing on trees and fall out of them, then there might be legitimate to give the person some responsibility. On the other hand, if you've got a surgeon who's never done these operations before but thought it might just be quite fun and it doesn't matter if it's only an Aborigine, to quote a case from Australia, and the woman dies, well, that's rather different. And then, of course, we've got the question about what's the initial reason, the person's health status, the reason for revision, the type of joint, the type of operation. Okay. So what I've been asked to do is to concentrate on data from the national registers. And I'm also going to pick up the Royal Orthopaedic Hospital data, if I can, because we have these different registers. I'm quite amused that the NJR is known as the NJR, or if you notice the full name. It is only for England and Wales. Data collection began in 2003. Similar for the Australian and the Nordic. Just out of interest, how many of you would already have a view as to which register will be most relevant?
Relevant for what?
Answering the question.
Okay.
Answering questions.
Nordic.
Yep, Nordic. Right, we're pretty. I'm pretty sure that the NARA will be helpful. And this one, provided the follow-up is done well, that will be useful for validation.
They know what they're doing, presumably, because they don't do anything else.
They know what they're doing surgically. Whether they know what they're doing with data collection is a different question.
There's a Scottish hip audit, which I answered, but I don't think it's
Oh.
very good.
You don't think it's very good?
Well, they didn't, I filled their form in, which wasn't wonderful. I'll look it out for you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
You assume the data's all for the same class of
Ah,
Yeah.
thank you. Right. So I've already heard from Serendipity, Uni Palmgren, who I met on Wednesday at Imperial. She did some analysis, I think, for the Finnish register, and said one of the biggest variants was the surgical skill. Okay. Quite a lot of the stuff that I've skimmed so far doesn't say very much about surgeons. There is some stuff from NJR about outlier surgeons. Okay, so data, what might we think about? Well, there's going to be completeness, and by completeness, I might think about selection into the register, completeness of follow-up, completeness of data, and so on. But before I think about the data, let's just think about one or two simple models. Okay, it's a nice simple question. So some people don't do this. I tend to like to start with a simpler model as I can think of, and then build it up to being something more realistic, getting insights from what's happening. So my first thought is, how would I want to model time to replacement? How might I model the data that one might see in a register? So we might think of person I having a replacement of type J at a date, SJI, and a revision at date, RJI. And almost as usual, for a date D, and I'm suppressing the fact that I could have my T's dependent on D and C's dependent on D at this time. I'm going to say let my actual time in here be the minimum of the date and whether the thing's failed or not, and a centering marker for whether it's failed or not. So 1 for censored, 0 for observed. Actually, I'm usually dealing with death, and I usually do it the other way around. Still.
Can you go back?
Mm-hmm. Now this is intended just to be very simple. It could be simpler, I agree.
What date D are you talking about here?
The point at which somebody decides to say, how are things doing? So if you're a regulator, so you might want to think of this from the perspective of a regulator. You've been told to, we have a Committee of Safety of Medicines, or had changes. We have a MHRA is the medical, no, I've lost it again.
Healthcare regulatory.
Healthcare regulatory. I'm sorry, I keep thinking of Mersey Region Health Authority because it's like a swap. Medical Healthcare Regulatory Authority. And they have they are charged with deciding whether something is working or not. And NICE, National Institute of Clinical Excellence, has guidelines on revision rates. And so then they are going to periodically check what's happening. Now, they might decide, oh, I'm going to do that every calendar year. They might decide we've had people flagging up there's a problem, we want to look at the data now. Okay, the reason I include this is that if you start putting in a new type of HIP in 2016, and you then say, how safe is it? And you say, will it last 20 years? Clearly, you can't necessarily answer that question. And so if somebody says, you gave me a HIP in 2010, that you should have known will have to be revised within 10 years.
Revised, you mean replaced?
Revised or replaced. No, it isn't necessarily replaced. Sorry, that's another complication. Okay. You can't in 2010 say you have got to be able to give me an accurate estimate of the 10-year survival rate. Therese, don't worry, I'm not bothered. None of us are bothered.
I'm trying to understand what your symbols mean.
So what I'm saying is,
so these so the S
is the date of operation.
The date of operation, and the R is a date as well. It's not it's not relative. It's an absolute date.
It's an absolute date, yeah. So
Right.
SJ might be 23rd of January 2000, and RJ might be 17th of December 2016.
Right.
Okay, the dates, right.
C is an indicative variable for whether it's failed or it's good.
C is an indicator variable. Either tells you if C equals 1, then we don't yet know when or if it will be replaced, and we may never know. If it's 0, then we know it has been replaced for the date I chose to look at things. So when I'm looking at people with cerebral palsy, if I look at things for December 2015, I will not know whether some people have died or not. It's a straight censoring.
You're choosing R.
It's a straight censoring. I'm not choosing R, I'm choosing D. If I decide, if I've got a cohort of people with cerebral palsy born between 1960 and 2000, if I look at them for 31st of December 2015, right, if they're not dead, I cannot put down their date of death, right? Anybody whose hip has not been revised, so for Gillian, I cannot say what her revision date is. She may never have it revised. All I can say is, all I can say is she has had a hip for 6 months.
So sorry,
Year and a bit.
Revision means doing some actual work on it.
Yes.
Okay, revision doesn't mean checking.
No.
Okay.
No. Sorry. Okay.
mean,
No.
sometimes having it taken out and reset and all.
It may be taken
That's
out,
replaced,
it may
isn't it?
be, sometimes it might be, might just be opening it up, washing it out.
Some work has to be done.
Yeah.
It's not a check. It's not a checkup. It's
No,
an actual
something
amount of
is
work.
done. Right, okay. And something surgical is done as opposed to just giving antibiotics when you eventually persuade them to or whatever. And in fact, the number of infections might be a different kind of thing to measure, but that's not
Well, the
what's
two
meant
are
by
related,
revision.
actually. The email-
Of course they are.
Yeah, because
I'll come
the
on to
email-
that.
And you're not distinguishing multiple revisions.
Well, as I said, I'm starting with a simple model, right? Okay.
My problem was I didn't understand what
A revision. Okay,
meant.
yeah, no, that's fine. That's
But
fine.
actually, you wrote, model time to replacement. I think you were interested in modelling time to revision, right?
Yes, thanks. Yeah, that's just a.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so replacement revision. If we just say, I've got the words muddled up, and there will probably be an argument by the orthopaedic surgeon telling me exactly what word I should use. So we could almost just say.
Because replacement was the time.
Sorry,
thing
I'm
was
going to say
surgery.
I meant to have. Hold on, no.
Placement, you mean?
Time to revision. Sorry, that should be time to revision, and replacement. I'm talking about the type of hip. That's why it's a replacement of type J. So that's your
Replacement.
initial replacement. Did you have a plastic hip
Yes.
or a wooden hip or a whatever you might like to think?
So perhaps we should call it placement, not replacement.
I will. Well, it's replacing the original hip.
Yeah.
That's why it's called a hip replacement.
I know.
Okay, so I'm going to consider K types of replacement or joint, if you like. And I'm going to start with revisions. So this is not looking at it, this is the doing something of only one type. So I'm not going to talk about the fact that the revision might be just putting in a new liner, or it might be taking the whole thing out and putting a new thing in, or that you might have taken a bit of bone, you've taken a bit more bone, etc. And also for the moment, I'm going to assume no deaths, because of course, earlier on, the main point of hip replacements was dealing with pain. It was in the elderly people, and that's why the censoring is important, because if you ignore the people who've died, or count them in the wrong way, either way you can get a massive change in what's actually happening. And I'm going to think of an initial time zero. I don't think this notation stuff is perfect yet, but I'm trying to work on a notation before I even then have to explain it to lawyers. So at the end of D years from time zero, so say we've got our new hips starting from 1st of January 2000, and we say at the end of 2005, the end of 5 years, 6 years that would be, I'm going to count the number of people, NJ, who've had that particular joint, the total follow-up time they've had, which is the sum, and I'm going to count how many of them have got revisions. Okay, so this, as I say, is still very simple, and we can think of two simple estimates of revision rate. The more sensible one would probably be the estimated revision rate, which allows for the time, total time. So that would be revision rates per 1,000 person years, for example. But we might just want to look at a revision rate as just the number of people who've been revised. Okay, so then what might we do? So we can trundle along and we can have look at our revision rates at 5 years, and we can have a look at them and we can find out what the minimum rate is and what the maximum rate is, and then we can get very upset because the maximum rate is bigger than the minimum rate. Shock horror. Now you might think I'm being cynical, but I think all of us have come across league tables and people saying, oh, isn't it terrible that the operational failure, death in hospital rate in this hospital is higher than that hospital when we've selected them that way. The example I would usually use would be to say, if we lined everybody up in this room in height order, should we be surprised if the smallest person is shorter than the tallest person? No, I mean, that's what we've done, okay? So the question we actually have to ask is, how far apart can they reasonably be?
So are these for capital K types?
Types, I'm sorry, yes, sorry, this is the
No.
trouble with... I've just literally written this, so that
I came
I
5
will
minutes
go
earlier
through.
and she was still writing.
Yes, okay. So, sorry, we've got the estimated revision rates for K types of treatment. So for my joint J, I have a revision rate that I want to estimate. Does this joint last long or not? So the question is, what's the joint distribution that we actually want to look at? Well, okay, so that's not that difficult. Sorry?
Sorry, the
That's
joint
because
distribution?
They made me.
Oh, yes, sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, that's good. I'm going to get into trouble with this
That's
one outside.
the
In
time.
fact, I could just see some of the judge getting horribly confused about my
Yeah.
talking about a joint distribution.
I got confused with joint replacements, like it was.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry.
Okay, I'm going to use A and B some of this. If we think about the minimum and the maximum, we can ask about what the joint distribution is. Okay, the distribution of either of them is quite simple because if you're assuming they're IID, and I did say I'm oversimplifying everything in sight, then we know that the probability that the maximum is greater than a particular value is simply the product of all of them being, they've all got to be bigger than that value. And equally for the minimum, they've all got to be smaller than that value. But what we actually want to say, if we're going to ask the question of are the minimum and maximum rates too far apart, we want to think about the probability of the distance between them. Okay, that's going to be part of what we need to think about. Okay, we can do some of these things and just think, okay, we could play with Poisson or binomial. They'll be our obvious starting points. Yes, once you get to the data, you're going to object to that, but that. Because, okay, what do the order statistics look like for, and I'm actually going to opt for binomial, okay, to do a small simulation. So I'm going to think about a rate per 1,000 for 5 types. It actually was over 3 years, but let's forget that. And this sort of rate is pulled from one of the national joint registers. And I'm looking at a simulated, right? Here are 5 types of joints. I shouldn't have used an A and B, but anyway, we've got 5 types of joints. If we actually look at them, we find the revision rate per million, PM, per 1,000, per meal, sorry. I never know whether to use K or P if I want to abbreviate. Okay, well the rates were, 11.2, or if you prefer, 1.12%, 1.2%, okay, with a mean.
Just per person, or it's not per time period?
Mm.
This is per, it's actually over 3 years, so it's actually per 1,000 over 3 years. But it was getting too messy to put all the stuff in. So yes, I mean actually, I've reduced this to just thinking of it as a simple binomial. In the background there is the rate per unit time, etc. But if we just treat it as a simple binomial, we can say, okay, that the overall rate was just under 1% in 3 years. So for 1,000 people, all operated on today, by 3 years' time, 9 of them would have had a revision. Then, of course, the next row, I've ordered them from smallest to largest, and we can go, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, the rate.
Sorry, but have you started assuming that they all have the same true?
Oh, this is a simulation.
Yes, but
Yes, yes,
assumed?
yes. It's a simulation of identical random variables.
Yes.
So they all actually had a mean replacement rate of, I think
You've
it
got
was
it there,
not-
9.25.
no, that's the mean of these actual values,
Oh,
because that's what
yes.
we would know. I think the simulation was either 1% or 0.9%. Okay, but in reality, of course, we wouldn't know. Okay, yes, I could also do it by stating this is what I simulated from, but that's another potential step. I'm just saying, imagine we'd got this, and I've set it up fairly simply. We've seen this. We could start by looking at the bottom row and say, isn't that terrible? B is obviously much worse than A. So its revision rate is twice as high.
D, B and D.
D, the
B and D.
D, yeah. And I could say, oh, what's the standard error for the difference? 2.7, 95% confidence for the difference. Oh, it doesn't include 0. Oh dear, D is definitely much worse than B. Okay, well, let's start thinking about some other questions. And incidentally, I say this because in the particular case, it looks as though this is what's happening. Sort of people look for the lowest possible rate and then say, this is the highest possible rate, this is a nice legal case. Sorry, not that I'm cynical. But, particularly in the States where 6 people have been awarded $1 billion of damages, because it's a negligence case there. Which I find spectacular, given that I know what's been awarded in cases of, a 16-year-old in a traffic accident landing up tetraplegic. So anyway, we're not doing the US style. Okay, so what could we actually ask? We can actually say, what is the probability that the maximum rate is 12.4 per 1,000 if the underlying rate is the average across all of them, 9.25? Well, it's not that difficult out of 2,500, which is where the 31 comes from, to get 31 or 32 or more replacements. And it's not that difficult to get the minimum rate being 16. But of course, those are 2 separate questions, right? That's still not asking the question about the difference. Okay, so one can then progress on to these 2 questions. What is the probability that the minimum rate is 6.4, the maximum is 12.4 if the underlying rate is that? And what is the probability that the range in rates is 6%? Okay, so if we want to look at the first question, and this is where, I don't know about you, but I usually get myself badly tangled up with order statistics once they get away from a single one. So I did something and then realised I got it wrong. So in actual fact, what we need to do is the joint distribution, and I'm starting just with the particular values, because what we'd actually have to consider is I've got 5. I've got 5 random variables and I've chosen only 2 of them. So I had 5 rates. I actually had 5 rates, but I've actually decided to focus only on the rate for D and the rate for B. So that's where the 5 is coming from. And then I'm saying, well, either the first value or the second or the third or the fourth could have been the smallest value, or the fifth could have been the smallest value. And similarly, we could have had the others being the top value. And then the different probabilities in here, let's see if I can actually work. The different probabilities are in here. This one is the probability that the first observation is less than or equal to 16. And this is the probability that in my last observation, whoops, seems to have got a stray, that should be a minus. This is the probability that effectively the last observation is the maximum, the last observation is greater than 31, and this is the difference between the 2. So what I'm doing is saying, I need to cut this up into a trinomial. How many different ways for these 5 variables can I get the smallest one no bigger than 16, the largest at least 31, and the others falling in between? So that's, and I have a horrible feeling I have left out, sorry, I have done, I've left out the factorials. So that's...
You're also writing probability A equals 16 and B equals 31, right?
I'm saying starting with that.
But you're computing the probability that A is...
No,
less
sorry,
than or equal
this
to
is my
16.
problem. Probability that the minimum is 16 and the maximum is 31. So these are not the types. As I said, I've still haven't got the notation.
Yeah.
This is now just, I was using, instead of using
So
little
this
m and
is-
capital M, I was saying, start with, what is the probability that the minimum is actually 16 and the maximum is actually 31? If I've
Yeah,
taken...
but if capital F is a cumulative distribution function and F of 16 is...
Oh, sorry, yes.
Is the probability of
sorry,
less than or equal
I've
to
started
16.
writing this down from the general continuous and didn't swap it to the discrete. Sorry, I was thinking of a continuous variable, and I haven't swapped that back to the discrete variable. That's what's wrong. So yes, that's another mistake. So if you...
Oh, so the outside big F should be little f.
So what it should be is... what I was doing was thinking for a continuous variable with f of x equals the probability that x is less than or equal to x. Oh, that one, sorry, that's another, that's a 1 minus f.
Yeah.
Damn, sorry,
Yeah.
that's the other one. Yeah, so sorry, this is, I've left out an n factorial, as Jeff said. I was still typing this up. I've left out n factorial, I factorial, j factorial, n minus I minus j factorial. And yes, I should be saying, because this is discrete, I'm wanting essentially my value to be less than or equal to 16. I want the values to be within 60, because of course they can be tied, it doesn't matter, because if you've got...
Yeah, but you're writing probability A equals 16, but I think you must mean probability A less than or equal to 16.
No,
And not
A
B
is-
equals
Okay,
31,
sorry,
but
what-
B greater than or equal to.
Okay, sorry, that's the point. Yeah, sorry, at that bit, that's, sorry. I thought I was, I've got mistakes there, so I've got another mistake about. Okay, yes, I'm saying we could, actually that's an interesting question. Do we want to ask this question? Well, this is, sorry, that's min, and that's max. Or do we want to ask this question? Minimum less than or equal to 16 and the maximum greater than or equal to 31.
That seems to be what you're calculating at the moment.
But that is what I'm calculating. Yeah, no, I'm saying that. Yeah, you're right. That's actually what I should have written.
Yes,
Well,
actually,
strictly greater than 31, I think. Greater or equal?
strictly larger than 30.
Well, the maximum actually is 31, and the minimum is actually 16. So which do I want?
Well, which you want.
Particularly because it's discrete, you know, it actually matters. And then of course there's, again with lots of errors. Okay, so this is gone all wrong, but of course that there's a different question. So, oops, I always forget that you can't do that. So, is the question on the previous page the right question, or should I be asking that this question? How likely is it that the maximum minus the minimum is at least 15, which is what these left-hand bits are doing, because I had 2,500. Obviously, most of the probabilities are, you can ignore them up about a certain amount. But in theory, one would then be saying, actually, I've got to get the formula correct. And then I've actually got to add it up over all of that. Okay, so I do need to get the formula correct, and I haven't written it. Obviously, within, once you're actually then writing, it's not that difficult to calculate, and it's not that difficult to do even include the more or less zero probabilities, although it's probably, I don't know whether numerically that's silly. So, okay, there's lots of mistakes in that. So my question, I suppose, more is, if I was going to ask the question about, if I'm a regulator, so I'm not thinking of legal case now, if I'm a regulator and new devices are going in and I am charged with trying to assess, as soon as is reasonably possible, whether, for example, one type of hip joint is defective, or I'm trying to assess, which is an issue that apparently has come up, whether one surgeon has unreasonable failure rates, or whatever. What is the best way to phrase that question? And that's what I'm looking at. Because of course there are other ways of phrasing it. You could say, if we take the average rate, is the maximum too high or not? So I guess you could have a bit of an argument about which of these 4 questions is the most sensible question to ask from the point of view of, say, a regulator, or from the point of view of a patient, in general, or from the point of view of a claimant, or from the point of view of a manufacturer who wants to withdraw a product if it's not safe? Which is the question to ask.
Are you asking us for feedback now? Or-
All right, let me do one other thing and then I'll come back to this. I just wanted to say before you start telling me I haven't thought about them.
Yes, please finish your presentation.
Okay, what's the actual reality? Well, of course, I've set it up quite simply, but what types are available and therefore might get chosen shifts with calendar year. The types themselves have got various classifications. I didn't know until I was told 3 days ago that actually there are 2 different ways of operating as well as whether you cement or not. You probably could get down to arguing about the exact chemical composition because you get, so there are 3 big groups. There's ceramic, metal, and polyethylene. Polyethylene has got shifted from one grade to another, but some people still prefer the old grade, and there's now a 3rd grade, so you've got a choice of 3 grades of polyethylene. I have no idea about how much engineers might want to talk about the exact metal compositions, because of course you've got metal compositions. And again, it's going to be a standard issue that you come up with, which people say, I want to know what exactly is relevant for this, 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 and this, which stage you say, well, there's only one person in the world who's had that. Then you've got the surgeons, both their approaches to surgery and their skills. So is it their first operation or not, and how many have they done? And I'm sort of condensing into that, plus the whole care package, because with MRC and NIHR now, if you're doing a complex intervention, and this would count as one, you are actually supposed to think about the entire package, which means the hospital, the nursing care, the after-surgery care, the health visitor care, and so on. These are all things, okay, maybe we will just have to say these are sources of variation, we're just going to bung them all into some random effect. We've got the start dates, so my nice simple thing of having the same numbers is obviously completely wrong. We're going to have different numbers of different types. What is the lag in notification to registers? With death, in the UK, I would normally allow a 3-month lag to be told about deaths, 3 to 6 months. There are occasional deaths which do not get notified for about, you don't get registered for about a year to 18 months. In England and Wales and Scotland, you now do get the death registered. You just don't get the calls. What about notifications to the registers? If you're setting up a national register and you're asking all your hospitals and your surgeons to fill in forms to let you know what's happening, how often are the surgeons going to have the time to do that? Speaking as somebody who's surfing deadlines at the moment, I'm not suggesting that's a criticism of the hospitals or the surgeons. It's a touch of realism. What about deaths? As far as I can see from what I've skimmed so far, actually the people on the registers are not flagged for deaths. They're relying on hospital episode data. I need to find out exactly what it is that they're doing, but there seems to be a bit of an assumption that the deaths will come in through the standard NHS system and there's no need to use the Office for National Statistics system.
That's okay in Scotland. That's okay in Scotland.
Well, it might be okay in England as well, I just don't know. But I
You
mean,
wouldn't get his deaths outside hospital. There's not very many of those. That's the Scottish case.
okay. But again, I'd still be interested to know the lag in notification. And of course, I'm not completely up to date with cancer registries and the workshop that's been going on this week in terms of they used to be mandatory, but then of course with the data protection and dropouts, they may not be. So I don't. You used to be able to, when you flagged a patient with ONS, you could flag for cancer as well, and you would get told when that person got cancer, again with the lag, and when they died. What I don't know is whether you could still do that, but cancer is one of the concerns that has been raised, and therefore that's a question.
What sense is it a concern?
Yeah.
The people who
Because
get
of
sick
association.
People
won't have
claiming
revisions
that
anymore.
no, people claiming that this type of joint has a higher cancer rate than that type. So, for example,
Association.
polyethylene, the wear causes osteolysis, which is basically that the wear product makes your bone rot. Okay, so there's also a question of does it also give you cancers? The metal, so the reason you moved, you think about ceramic or metal is it doesn't have polyethylene, but of course that means what are the effects of ceramic and of metal? And cancer is, I don't actually know, and I don't know if Gillian's looks wrong, I don't know how big a risk there is of cancer with, I mean my memory isn't actually a big risk, but it's the kind of thing that people worry about, partly because hip replacements will go into older people get cancer, and therefore like MMR vaccines and autism, you've got a potential time, a reason why things might turn up and might be difficult to tease out.
Because I was thinking of a different problem, sort of the opposite one, which is that maybe a hip replacement usually lasts some length of time, then needs to be revised. But if in the meantime you get very sick, then you may still be alive for a number of years, but you're not going to bother to have that revision done anymore.
Then that's what I'm getting at. I mean, I haven't put everything in here. The reasons for the revision, the ease of the revision, the types of the revision. So why are you revising it? Okay, I have no idea how many, but there are a number of reasons. One is you can land up with a badly infected joint. I have a friend, how old is she now? She's about 22, who's had to have her shoulder replaced for cancer, okay. And she's had numerous replacements, and very often for infection. So infection is one of the reasons. If you've got, I can't remember whether she got a wooden joint, because in the end they've begun to think wood might be good material. So even if you do the best you can get these infections. Your hip can dislocate. Your hip, if you fall, the hip can dislocate, and you might also break part of it. If you fall with a ceramic hip, it will shatter and send shards of ceramic, everywhere, right? This is like people thinking, can I have a drug that has no side effects, right? It doesn't quite work that way. So why is it getting revised? Or have you read something and you think, oh, I've heard that polyethylene causes bone, to go, I want this out. Then there's the ease of revision. So if you've taken out the whole hip, the whole top of the hip, and if you've got the, my anatomy's not going to be very good, but you've got, right, if you've just taken out the top of it, initially you may be able to then replace the next time around with something going into the joint. If you've cemented things in both sides, you've got to chop it out. If you've just fitted it in and screwed in a liner, you might be able to just take out the liner, put in a new liner. So they're going to be different degrees, and my guess is that if you've got something where you've got your joint and you've got a liner, my guess is that the time it takes to come in, unscrew a liner, or unclip a liner to something that's screwed in, and put in a new liner, almost certainly that's going to take less time than chopping out a cemented in hip, tidying up the bone, shoving in another one. So therefore, your cancer point, therefore, how easy is this going to be? Well, one of the things is going to be things like how long will it take? Because anaesthetic is basically poison. Therefore, if it's an easy revision and you've got, say, a pretty obese person, which will make the anaesthetic more difficult for various reasons, and you're just changing a liner, you might do it, but your cost-benefit analysis, if you've got to have them under anaesthetic for much longer and you're chopping out a lot more, might be different. So, the types of revision might be different. Be nice to know about that. Well, that's lovely, and I'm sure you can suggest a whole lot more things I should think about. But are we going to get these covariants? are we going to get, for example, body mass index, which might or might not be important, not only for the wear, but actually for the ease of the operation and the risks associated with it? Are they going to be, if we do get body mass index, for example, is it going to be how much do you weigh and how tall are you, or is it going to be measured? And when? Is it even going to be there? If you're getting things into a central register, you're going to have a trade-off. You can ask for lots and lots of covariates, in which case people will never get round to giving you any information. Or you can ask for less. But, okay, I keep getting told that, no, of course, the world is perfect. You can ask for everything you want and you'll get everything perfectly and, you know, everybody will consent. Well, of course, selection into the registers is quite a big issue. 2007, which happens to be the one I looked at, you've got 68% consent. Now, that would be lovely if these were missing at random. How many of us think they're going to be missing at random? Not a lot of us. What do we know in general about who tends not to give consent and not to be easy to follow up? And I'm not sure quite how relevant it'll be here, because it's going to depend on the definition of the second word. The people who are most difficult to track down are men who are young. Okay, so the definition of young is perhaps questionable here, because there will be a difference between your 18 to 25-year-olds and your sort of 30s upward, which is more, you will get a few hip replacements earlier, but not higher up. So if we had the situation in which your young men are getting a particular type of replacement and your old women are getting a different type of replacement, and you don't look at the selection, what you might be getting, of course, is a whole lot of very happy, healthy young men who have ignored any request for consent to have their data, and they're all doing fine. But if your type is disproportionately focused on them and you've got no information on them, you're probably going to overestimate your revision rate. It could go the other way as well, of course, but you might well do. So that's really, as far as I'm concerned, quite an important question. The other thing that I should have, I just put in deaths. If you have, of course, got to do a competing risks analysis, because in the older populations, a lot of people are going to be dying, and you need to put them in consistently. You can't, the classic way we introduce survival analysis. If you ignore all of the people who've died, you'll underestimate what's happening, and if you put them all in as failures, if you said, oh well, failure is having to have a surgical revision or dying, well then of course you're going to have a much higher rate as well. So you do have to do the correct competing risks. The point is you've got to do the competing risks and then probably run for the minimum and maximum and decide what question you should be asking about if we pick this up is the worst rate. So I'm not really sure what I'm going to be doing.
Or are you going
Sure.
on to something else? This is absolutely crying out for a record linkage. Have you applied to the ADRN to link these joint
I've got to
replacement
produce a report
registers
by
to
the
hospital episodes?
The NJR use HES, okay.
Because if you did that, you would be able to find out you'd be able to do that's right, but you could also find out which ones were missing and who was missing.
That's what I still haven't had time to do,
Yeah.
is to read through all the reports and see how much of the analysis they've done. The one thing that I've seen that used NJR, which looked at cancer, said blithely, well, the missing people were fairly similar in age and gender distribution, and then gave a table which showed you how widely varied things were. So I need to find out if it has been done.
Yeah. I will try and find out the next
But
week
Scottish, yeah.
the Scottish one is, and we can stick an application into the ADR in Scotland if you're interested.
Well, it might be interesting to do some work on this separate from the legal case, yes.
Yes.
Yes, because I think it needs to be done.
Yeah.
It's not all going to get finished by the 16th of January or the 3rd of March, which is when I've got to
Yeah.
get things done.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, the other thing is that you were just doing an overall rate, but there are clearly very different consequences from an early failure and a late failure. You
yes,
have to divide
yes.
that follow-up period.
yeah, I'm glad you
So-
picked that up, because that's one of the ones I looked at, and I noticed that quite a lot of the graphs that I've just looked at, a number of them, and to be fair, some of the papers address this. A number of them have the failure rates, which do a kick up, and then they go like that.
Yeah, sure.
And so, of course, if you just use a Cox proportional hazard model from
Yeah.
time of replacement, as opposed to saying we should take 6 months, you may well get something very different. And I don't.
Yes, I mean, if they fail right away, or they fail within a month or two because of infection.
Yeah.
That's a real disaster area.
Of course.
Particularly for metal hips, apparently. You have to have the whole thing taken out because the bugs hide on the hip.
Yeah, I might have missed this right at the beginning, but so you talked about responsibility allocation or assignment, and so I was just kind of naive question, but presumably you need to kind of address kind of like almost like counterfactual questions, like, well, if this surgeon wasn't very good, but would this person's hip had failed quicker if it had a better surgeon? Because it might, but so then you need to
Yeah, you
So-
can adjust for case mix.
somehow. Sorry.
It's called adjusting for case mix, is the phrase they use for
Okay.
the type of patients you get.
Right, yeah, so, but for every factor, you're going to worry
Yes.
about that in the individual
Yeah.
case.
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering how you, what kind of framework do you use for, or is there a framework? I mean, I would naively think that some kind of causal modelling framework would be needed there, and I'm not,
Well, yeah, I mean, that's coming down to the individual level.
yeah, or
Which I agree.
Be a group, I suppose.
But even at the group level, yes, I mean, the trouble is that looking at this, as I said to the barristers who weren't too thrilled with me, even agreeing on what the questions are, once you've defined those questions, almost certainly nobody has written down the likelihood of the right form, let alone coded it, let alone found good data. So I'm trying to work out how to pitch my report because the lawyers want to be able, the judge will want to be able to make a decision. And I've already said I'm not going to be coming up with an answer or anything. I'm going to be coming up with, I think these are a number of questions one might reasonably ask. This is how one might phrase them. And this is how the data relates to them. This is what one might ideally want to do, but data isn't available, the software isn't available. And hence we need to do something. So this isn't available, and the kinds of things that one might want to do. I mean, what response are you going to get from a judge when I say, oh, by the way, even if we just think of a simple binary with none of the things you've mentioned, this is the kind of stuff we get. So we got the results, then we've got to describe the uncertainty in the results. Then I've got to say best case and worst case given the quality of the data. If it were the case that all the missing people had no problems, which is why they didn't bother to get in touch and give consent, what would that do to the rates? If the missing people didn't give consent because they were fed up because everything had gone badly wrong, which is another story you can tell, the rates would be this. So we've then got to do it, and then, right, this is not my, I can't ask that question, of course, but I could comment on, if a reasonable person wanted to know what the trade-off of dislocation, ease of revision, range of movement is, what information, and likelihood of your initial, category, what information should they be given? So, it's sort of, it's great fun to sort of start putting in a thing saying these things are defective. It's not quite so much fun. At which point you think, why didn't I run away fast? It's not quite so much fun actually saying, well, where does this go? What are the legitimate questions? What is? I mean, I think it's quite possible that one of the options open to the judge is to say, we cannot define this as a defect. If it is defined as a defect, you then have the next question, which is, at what stage could you have known it was a defect? So there's another legal case which says, okay, in 2016 we know this, but actually, this, this drug was withdrawn from the market in 2010 because the manufacturer had reports. I mean, okay, so there was a cystic fibrosis case I sometimes use. And drugs is very simpler. 5 cases of a severe complication, and a warning goes out saying, if at all possible, move back from this drug to that drug while we investigate. Now, the trouble with a joint replacement, you can't say, oh, by the way, change the joint to a different one while we investigate. But even if you can, if you a patient who got prescribed a drug in 2009 couldn't really bring a complaint if the data to tell you what the side effects were only came in 2010. It's not, you might be sympathetic, but in terms of responsibility, the information isn't there. So that would be the second stage. One of the other problems is under the reasons for revision is, of course, there was media, and so some of these graphs seem to do something like that, and then you kick up, you get a change point. Now, if you're starting to revise things because people have alleged they cause cancer, and it turns out that in fact they don't cause cancer, you've got a higher revision rate. Now, is that revision rate, is that a legitimate way of assessing a failure? If the revision is caused by a false alarm?
Yeah, that's a real problem, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, reason for revisions is going to be horribly.
It's going to be horribly confounded in with it. And I suspect, if I can say, I'm going to swap the data, I suspect that you're then going to have to find that the data is rather unclear. But as I say, I mean, I'm interested in the trying to also think about the generic question of what would be sensible approaches to this, just like, David Spiegelhalter talking about league tables and communication of risk. What is a reasonably sensible, reasonably robust approach for the National Joint Register or the MRHA?
Yeah, it depends very much who you're talking about. So
yes, of course, and that's
I got the impression that if we talk about what should a regulator be doing, it looks very much like questions of quality control, and there's enormous literature on how you can follow a time series of results about quality of industrial products.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to talk to Tim Davies about this. Yeah.
When to conclude that something, when to put an alarm.
What's the specific context of your work in this? For this, you said with the deadline, is it that you've, because I'm not exactly understanding, is it to determine based on data that's available whether a particular class of hip replacement is excessively defective because someone's brought a legal claim against them?
One of the difficulties is that yes, there is a legal claim for a class, but actually the claim itself is quite vague. The claim itself has not actually been very clear. The claim is simply that this product is defective.
Because this puts it into an interesting class of problems that we've looked at over many years, which are sort of classic reliability of systems problems, where actually what the problem here is that you're trying to assess whether this particular class is particularly unreliable, defective, whatever, and what you're actually doing is, of course, it's you're conditioning it, you're comparing it with effectively failure rates of different classes. Okay, so you're somehow trying to learn what the sort of the true underlying sort of failure rate of this is, and then make a comparison against effectively things which are different, right?
And that's why I started with this thing. You're doing minimum maximum comparisons. It's not. I mean, I do want to talk a bit, check a bit more on the industrial quality control, but I don't know how much of that is about seeing the level and changing it, and how much of that is about comparison. Yeah, sorry. So yeah, reliability. It's very much reliability of systems, and one of the questions is, what is the relevant comparator? And clearly, the claimants are going to want to say, well, the best performing item is X, and therefore that's the only possible comparator. And the defendants will say, X is used in this class of patients, and therefore, and Y is used in this class of patients, and therefore you can't just do that. And also, if you post hoc pick the smallest, this is one of the things that I just showed the impact of for meta-analysis 16 years ago. If you pick a minimum or a maximum, and then treat it as if it were a standard normal, you're going to get badly wrong, even if you're only picking a maximum of 2, let alone the others. So I don't know how much the reliability of systems.
Well, we ended up doing what Dave's just been, because especially when you've got novel, when there's a reason for introducing this new type,
exactly,
right? It would have novel requirements, right? And then inevitably you end up with causal models and the need to incorporate expert judgment about what the impact
so this
of the new requirements are.
and certainly what there is on both sides is sort of orthopaedic surgeons, development teams, people with the engineering, people who discuss exactly how the joints work and why you want to, what you've got the reason, the motivation for changing things. So one of the things that I don't know the exact history, but ceramic was obviously thought to be good because it's pretty inert. It's not like polyethylene, which is not going to wear in the same way. But of course, it then shatters. So yeah, one of your requirements is that the thing shouldn't fail disastrously, in the sense of instead of gradually wearing out, that it shatters and causes you all these problems. But then another requirement was the dislocation, because the hip's going into younger people. If you're putting a hip into somebody who's in a lot of pain and you're now allowing them to walk a kilometre or 2 slowly, you're probably not so worried about dislocation, because they're not that likely to be doing anything very wild. I mean, if they fall, okay, but that's no problem. But if you're putting a hip into a young person because they want to carry on being active in sports, then dislocation may well become another problem. And the argument in favour, so one of the discussions, not I think in this case, is about the size of the hip replacement. And they started putting in larger hip joints with the idea that they'd be less likely to dislocate. And so there was a whole lot of engineering argument as to why you would use this, Just as there are arguments about the metal and the polyethylene, there's sort of discussion about do you want to